Think a career as an audiologist might be for you? It's a very ambitious choice. However, keep in mind, like all professions, this is not for everybody. But if it is for you, the rewards are tremendous. And that's the subject of this episode. Welcome to another episode of the Daniel Ross Cast. In this episode, I interview a friend of mine who's an audiologist, and two things really stood out to me. One was how high level profession this really is, and then the other was just some of the things that they do in this profession that I never really would have associated with audiology. And of course, like all professions, this really isn't for everybody. There's very particular reasons why. But if it is for you, if you're the kind of person that can hack it in this profession, the rewards are amazing. The payoff is just tremendous. So it's really something worth taking a look at. All right, but enough on that. Let's get right into it. Oh, and just as a quick aside, this is an audio-only episode. I screwed something up during the production process, so the video came out really jacked up, and I couldn't in good faith publish it. So I just instead decided, scrap it, gonna go audio-only. I threw in a little bit of B-roll footage for some entertainment. So you're an audiologist. If you could briefly describe, just broadly speaking, what an audiologist does, and then we'll kind of get into details.
Of course. So an audiologist is basically a specialist in hearing and balance disorders. So most commonly people think of an audiologist when they think of someone who fits hearing aids to cure or remediate hearing issues.
Sure. All right. So you're servicing all sorts of different. It's almost like when you hear a speech therapist, you think it's all you're just helping the person speak properly or something to that effect. It's actually there's several things going into this. Okay. So maybe describe in brief detail what a typical day might look like. What are the tasks? I know, like for me, I check in, I see my patients, but maybe you can get into brief detail about what an audiologist's typical day might look like.
Well, part of that kind of depends upon the environment in which you work. So most audiologists will work in a private practice setting, or they'll work in a hospital, or they will support an ear, nose, and throat clinic. So a typical day would involve hearing assessments, may involve doing hearing aid fittings, and depending upon the setting, might also involve assessing dizzy patients and helping to teach patients how to adapt to dizziness issues.
So maybe something like a vertigo type of issue.
Correct.
All right.
Correct.
So suffice it to say, it sounds like you deal with a little like inner ear issues.
It can be, yeah. Predominantly, that's the part of the body that we're focused on. So whether it's balance or dizziness issues related to the inner ear, or it's hearing disorders, because they're all essentially interrelated.
Okay. All right. So how many patients might you expect to see in a day? You're saying you typically work in like an outpatient private practice, right? So you're not necessarily going to be seeing too much in say hospitals or nursing homes or sub-acute rehab, things like that. So it's outpatient. How many patients might you see in a day?
So typically a full assessment will take an hour to complete. So you might see between 6 and 8 patients a day. That's a typical audiology appointment. It's not a quick in and out primary care type of setting. It's specialty care. So there's a little bit more time allocated. And sometimes it'll depend upon what all you have to do with your patient. So typical assessment's about an hour, but if you're also doing a hearing aid fitting, or if you're doing a balance assessments can take up to 4 hours to complete. So it depends upon the setting, it depends upon the type of patient you're seeing as to how much time you're going to allocate, and therefore how many patients you're going to see in a day. But in audiology, it's pretty normal hours. I mean, it's like an 8 to 5 type of day.
That was something else I wanted to ask you about as well, because that's very important. A lot of people who are looking into different careers, as I know for me, I wanted a day job. I didn't want something where I'm working, mega overtime, things like that. So maybe, so it's mostly kind of your Monday through Friday type of of job, maybe a daytime shift. I don't think people are coming in too late in the day to get their hearing aids. But that sounds about right.
That's correct. Yeah. So that was one of the things that kind of drew me to audiology to begin with. It was healthcare without some of the drawbacks of being a physician that might have to work odd hours, might have to work weekends. It's pretty much a Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 type of job, unless you're in sort of niche areas like the job I'm in currently. But most of the time, it's pretty normal hours.
Okay, good. And speaking of which, we'll definitely be getting into that. But so that's important to know. So like if somebody wants to get into healthcare, but like you said, they don't want to be on call, or they don't want crazy shifts, because that's common with nursing, CNAs, all sorts of other things. If somebody wants to get into healthcare, that's something to consider. Nice. So what type of personality or personality traits might go well with this? I know for some people, I've met people who say, are extremely introverted. They might be best as an engineer, or extremely extroverted. They might be great as a salesperson. So maybe you can elaborate what kind of personality probably benefits most from this type of job.
For the job of audiology, I would say you do need to have a certain baseline set of people skills.
Yep.
So you have to be able to talk. You also have to be able to talk to the hearing impaired. So if you notice, when I talk to you, it's very deliberate. My voice is a little raised. I talk a little slower. My patients always say, "You're easy to understand." And I say, well, that's because I've been trained to talk this way.
Right.
But personality that's a little bit more on the outgoing side is good. But if you're also somebody who's a little more introverted, that's okay in this field, because part of what we do is also very scientific. So if you're a person who likes to delve into the details and wants to be involved in detailed work, it's also a good fit. So you don't have to be particularly outgoing to be an audiologist, but it helps to be if you have a natural inclination towards talking to people.
Right. And like I said, with problem solving, like if you're somebody who wants to get not just the people aspect of it, the interaction, but solve complex problems, this might be a good fit for somebody doing that.
Definitely a technology edge to it. So you have to be someone who wants to be able to, say, troubleshoot hearing aids, which hearing aids are very advanced technology anymore, and it takes a lot of routine training and updating to keep on top of the technology and to understand the technology. So even if you're engineer-minded, audiology is a pretty good fit just because of the technology aspect.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe we can dive into that a little bit. So speaking of technology, I mean, and of course we're going to get into the education aspect of this later, but I want to touch on it now real quick since we're on the subject. Technology, I'm going to guess that the field is fairly, it's one that evolves, right? As technology is constantly evolving. So what kind of follow-through education are you going through? I imagine, just like in my field in physical therapy, there's always continuing education requirements. I imagine the same is for you.
That's true. So we have both licensure requirements, and then there's just keeping on top of the technology. So I have to renew a state license every year, and that requires a certain number of continuing education units, which is state dependent, obviously. But then there's also just the initiative you have to take upon yourself in order to stay on top of the hearing aid technology, which most audiologists will take training about every 6 months with the manufacturers that they most commonly work with. And there's a number of hearing aid manufacturers. Most audiologists will limit themselves to having the full breadth of technology knowledge to 2, 3, maybe 4 manufacturers, because it is a lot to keep on top of every 6 months or so, because the software changes, the model of hearing aid changes, and so you have to stay on top of that.
Okay, so a little bit of tech savviness,
yes,
we'll call it. Very nice. All right. Now, one thing that I like about my job is the degree of autonomy that I have. Maybe you could elaborate, what degree of autonomy do you have? I know a lot of people, some people like to be told what to do, right? They don't want to think about what to do, they just want to show up, just tell me what to do, and I'm going to do it. Other people, I just leave me alone, let me do my work. So where might you fall in that spectrum in the field of audiology?
It's quite autonomous. So you have to be able to operate independently. That doesn't mean that you're not going to collaborate with your professional partners. If you work in an ENT clinic, an ear, nose, and throat clinic, you're going to be frequently working with the ear, nose, and throat physicians because you're their support service. Especially if they have an otologist, which is an ENT that specializes in just the ear. You're going to be working very closely with that person. It's kind of like the difference between an ophthalmologist and an optometrist. They both complement each other. They both have to work together. But if you're not in an ENT setting, if you're in a private practice, you might be the only audiologist who is there. And so you have to be able to function completely independently with a high standard of care and a high code of ethics, because there is no one standing over your shoulder, making sure that you're doing the right thing every day. It's incumbent upon you to do that.
Yeah, and with solving problems, right? Because you don't always have somebody to go to and say, hey, what do I do in this scenario? You have to be able to look up your resources and similar to physical therapy, you're expected to be relatively independent, but for more complex problems, you can go. But it sounds like for you, there's an even greater need for independence and solving problems on your own.
Yes.
Yes. Nice. Okay. And that of course is important to some people. They want to be their own person, and that's something to consider. So what's physically like what kind of physical involvement is in this job? I mean, I can't imagine there's a ton of bending, lifting, twisting, but that may be something to consider. Some people don't want very jobs of high physicality, so maybe you can just quickly describe what a day might look like in terms of what they'll be doing physically.
It is a fairly sedentary job, but that said, if you get into the vestibular, the balance piece, that requires a higher degree of physical capability because you're going to be physically helping your patient get into equipment. You're going to be helping them manipulate their bodies in order to be able to conduct the test that you're hoping to do. So you have to have a certain degree of ability to move. You have to be able to lift a patient. You have to be able to help if there's a fall. So depending upon which niche of audiology you get into, there may be more or less requirements for physical capability.
Okay. So some physical, but largely relatively sedentary.
Yes.
So again, important to consider for some.
Yes.
Kind of a more casual side of things, what might somebody be expected to wear? Not all of us want to wear a suit and tie to work, and some of us may not want to wear, on the other end of the spectrum, boots and a Carhartt. So what might you put on for the day?
If you work in a private practice, it's usually business casual. If you work in a hospital setting, it's probably scrubs.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we've talked about the job itself. Now let's talk about getting into the job. So let's start with the education aspect of it. Obviously this is post high school.
Yes.
You're going to be going through college to get a job like this, but maybe we can start with what's the degree that you would need to get, baseline, to get into this field?
In order to be a licensed audiologist, you have to have a doctoral level degree. So it's about an 8-year commitment. First for the bachelor's degree, which is typically in communication science and disorders, and then another 4-year post-bachelor degree towards audiology. And typically your last year is a residency year.
Okay. So it's going to be something that you need to want to do this.
You sure do.
There's you don't want to get 5 years in and
right.
This is a big commitment. Like any MD, high level stuff, you got to know that you want to do this. And I guess that's probably good because they can kind of weed out the non-hackers.
Right.
Let's talk about like the intensity of the coursework. I know for some programs there are no breaks. I've looked at for doctorate in physical therapy, for instance. Your summers and winters are full time. So maybe you can talk about that, the intensity of the coursework, maybe the amount of courses you're going to be taking per semester, things like that.
So I can't speak to what it looks like presently because bear in mind, when I went to school, I graduated in 2001. But even then, and the way I understand it is now, it's full-time coursework. So, and depending upon which degree program you pick, you might even be part of an accelerated program. So there are some universities that will allow you to complete the post-bachelor portion of your degree in 3 years instead of 4. So, but anticipate that it's going to be full-time coursework. When I was going to school, it was 3 classes a day plus clinical hours. So it was a full day. You'll commit a lot of time to learning the craft.
Yes. Okay. And that's something to consider. So were you able to work while you were in school?
I was. It was challenging though. I worked a full-time job and I went to school full-time. I was the only one in my class who did that. You have to be an incredibly good time manager when you choose to go that. I wouldn't recommend that people work a full-time job while they're trying to get an audiology degree. If I were to do it again, I would not do it like that.
Certainly. Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
But the times dictated that I had to.
Okay. And then let's get into some of the post education, continuing education. Excuse me.
Okay.
So what might that look like? Because you're going to have probably so many hours or so many credits that you have to do per licensure cycle. And actually, if we could back up, before we even get into that, let's talk about the licensure itself. Because a lot of health professions, they have a national exam right after. And so maybe you could give us just a brief overview on that, because those are very intense.
Yes, we do have what's called a praxis, which is a test of your clinical competency administered by the American Speech and Hearing Association along with your state licensing board. So it is pretty intense. It's a day-long, both didactic and practical exam where you have to be able to answer questions and then demonstrate skills. So you have to pass your praxis in order to be able to be licensed.
Yes, and so it's not to say you've done your education, now you're done. No, that's you have one final crucible to do before you get that license.
Right.
And then once you have that license, let's talk about continuing education. Like we said, I imagine there's a certain number of continuing education credits or hours. How does that work?
It depends upon your state. So I'm licensed in the state of Arizona, and I have to get 12 credits per year in continuing education units.
Okay. All right. And so let's kind of tie this all together. Overall, what would you say some pros? Let's go over some pros and cons, because this isn't for everybody.
Sure.
I think we did highlight some as far as what your day might look like, personality, the education requirements. Just maybe in your own experience, some pros and cons that you might offer to somebody who's considering this. We want people to know. You want people to know what they're getting into.
Sure.
Right. So, and let's be realistic about it. It's not all rainbows and butterflies, but it's not all drudgery either.
Right.
So maybe you could elaborate a little based on your experience.
So I think for me the pros have been that it's healthcare without the drawbacks of healthcare. It's a low stress environment because we don't carry the same sorts of liability for injury that maybe other healthcare professions do. There's relatively little you can do in the world of audiology to actually cause harm to someone. So you're providing healthcare in a low risk, low stress type of environment. The cons is what we do, there's really no perfect solutions because hearing loss is a permanent injury that happens on a microscopic level, no amount of technology can replace what the human ear was originally capable of doing. And so sometimes it's hard to balance the technology against people's expectations. A lot of times a patient's expectations of what their outcome is going to be once you fit them with a hearing aid is above what the hearing aid is actually able to do. So they think they're going to be the bionic man or woman.
Yeah,
and they're going to
be restored.
Restored, yes.
And the reality is a little more sobering.
That's correct.
Sure.
We cannot give you back normal hearing. We cannot replicate. No level of technology can replicate what the human ear was originally able to do. It can make your life better. It can improve things, but it's not going to make it perfect. You're still going to ask people to repeat what they say. So that can be hard,
right,
day in and day out, to have to moderate the expectations for your patient.
But I'm sure just as in my field, you probably get some feedback. I know what I just myself. I had a patient walk on a walker for the first time this week after basically a spinal cord injury, and when you see that like that, it's one of those like that. That's why I like doing this. And I'm sure you have experiences like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. When somebody says to you that they heard something that they haven't heard in years for the first time again, and it's something that they want to hear, the voice of a loved one, or if you get into pediatrics and it's the first time a baby or a child is hearing their parent, it can be really emotional. And so those sorts of things are very rewarding.
So speaking of which, that's a good thing. I actually want to highlight that. So because we talked briefly about settings, which are fairly limited in your field, but beyond settings, there's age range, and there's probably extremes to that. There's, like you said, pediatric and probably the geriatric field, but there's probably not a lot in between. Am I fairly accurate in that?
Depends on what setting you're talking about. Audiology is really the spectrum. It's womb to tomb, where you can be providing services. But you're right. I mean, it is primarily one extreme or the other. But when we get to talking about my particular niche that I'm in now, there's actually the preponderance of people are in the middle range, and that's just a product of the organization I'm in.
Okay.
But
your specific.
Yeah, my specific one. But most of the time, if you're in private practice, really your average age is probably 75.
Okay.
But if you work in, say, the state school for the deaf and blind, your age range is the very young.
So suffice to say, if somebody's going to get into this field, they should probably expect to work with the older population.
They should.
Okay, so and then that's something very, very important to consider, because if you don't like dealing with old people, this is probably not for you.
Probably not.
That's very good stuff. Okay, so we've covered your, basically what the job is. I'd like to briefly talk about your journey through the job, because I know you said you started with some private practice, if I'm not mistaken, and now you work for the Navy. And so I'd like to get into that, because that's actually a very, I'm sure, very unique, but also, of course, as many of us know, the retirement benefits are pretty well out of this world compared to the civilian sector, which draws a lot of people in. And even though a lot of younger people may not think about those things, those that are, and those that would be watching this, I'm sure they are thinking of that. So maybe we can let's dive into your journey out of this civilian practice and into working with the military. How did that journey come about?
Yeah, so I was a dispensing audiologist, which is an audiologist that fits hearing aids primarily, for a clinic in Tucson, Arizona. And I had been in it for about 5 years when I was feeling a little bit of stagnation in the job. Doing hearing aids all day, every day, was getting to be a little repetitive for me, and so I was exploring other kind of niche opportunities for an audiologist. I'd never considered the military, but I happened to be on a lunch break, and I was in the strip mall across the street from where my office was. And as all good recruiting stations are, they're in the strip mall. And I remember standing in front of it thinking, I wonder if the military takes audiologists. And so I walked in, and I went to the Air Force table first. And they were all full up on audiologists. They weren't recruiting for my specialty that year. And the Navy table was right next to it, and I thought, well, I get pretty motion sick. I hope I don't have to go on a ship. So turns out that the Navy was absolutely taking audiologists because the community was undermanned for the Navy. It took about a year to actually make the transition from my private sector job into the Navy, because anytime you join the military, there's a number of steps. Candidacy being one of them, making sure, because the military, no matter what job you're going to go into, wants you to fit certain standards in order to be accepted.
Yeah, I was about to say competency requirements, things like that. Okay, all right. Did you, so there must have been some sort of testing for that, I imagine? No,
so if you're going the enlisted route and you're just, say you're coming out of high school and going straight into the military, there's what's called the ASVAB, which is basically a test you take to get in, and it determines what job you get assigned. For me, it was my degree alone. So when you're going into, in the Navy, we call the Medical Service Corps, you just have to meet the degree requirements. You have to meet citizenship requirements. You have to pass a background check. You have to meet certain physical fitness and body composition standards, just for the military.
All right. And then you would go in as an officer.
I did.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Very good. And so, how has being an audiologist in the military been different from in the civilian sector? Because and one guess, if I may make a guess, because hearing loss is one of the, from what I understand, the number one service-related disability. So I'm sure you absorb a lot of that. So maybe we can get into that.
You do. It's a very different animal than what you encounter in the private sector, because for the Navy, it depends a little bit upon where you end up being stationed, whether you're stationed stateside or you're stationed overseas. If you're stationed stateside, you're going to be doing hearing conservation. So rather than treating hearing loss, your job is hearing loss prevention, because the military is a very noisy industry. And as you alluded to, hearing loss is one of the top service-connected disabilities that veterans will report upon exit. So your job is to fit people with hearing protection, train them on hearing loss prevention. And so I actually haven't done much in terms of like purely clinical or rehabilitative audiology in quite some time. I've been on the prevention end of things. If you do get stationed overseas in the Navy, oftentimes you'll do both. You'll do both prevention and you'll do rehabilitation, because in places like Italy or Japan or Guam, you might be you might be alone as the only audiologist. You might be one of two. And so your job is to provide the services for everybody who's there, not just the service members, but also the service members' families. And so that's where you'll get into the rehabilitation piece. But stateside, it's all hearing conservation, and I've done nothing but hearing conservation for probably the last decade of my career.
Okay, very nice, nice. And so let's before we wrap this up, I also want to talk about before you got into the Navy. Let's rewind a little bit. So you're coming out of school. What's the abundance of jobs looking like? And this is important to know, because 8 years is a long time. And somebody might look at this and say, well, what's the world going to look like in 8 years? So what did you find the abundance of jobs to be when you came out of school?
You will not struggle, because our population is getting older.
Yes.
And so there is a ever-increasing need for hearing services.
Yes.
So as people live longer, the more they need age-related services, and so audiology fits very nicely into that picture.
Yes, and it's important to know, of course, we have the biggest generation, the baby boomer generation, getting into that, and we, such a small generation right now, is going to have to take care of that. So, simply by numbers alone, I mean, it's the same thing in my field. If you want a job somewhere, it's basically yours.
Right.
All right. So let's wrap this up. So broadly speaking, audiologist treats primarily hearing loss, but in certain unique settings can do hearing loss prevention. Your typical day might look something like doing assessments on patients, fitting with hearing aids, doing balance tests, like vestibular type of work. I'm guessing, right? This would be a good job for people who have great people skills, but also want to dive into complex problems. People who are independent. People who don't mind collaborating, though, with other people, but who don't mind working as their own unit. Somebody who doesn't want an overly physical job, but is maybe capable of doing things, like you said, if you have a fall, you might be expecting, if a patient falls, you might be expected to help them out. And as I'm sure you've experienced during a balance challenge, as I do all the time, patients get a little wobbly. You got to adjust that balance. So don't be completely chintzy, but you don't have to worry about being lumberjack stout.
Right.
Schedule you might experience. You're looking at primarily days, Monday through Friday. Your typical what you call 9 to 5. And as we said before, outpatient setting, private practice is most common, but you could find yourself in acute rehab, right, like a hospital primarily. Education, it is a doctorate, so you're looking at about, like you said, 8-year commitment, primarily starting in communication science and communication disorders for an undergrad, and then you would go into your postdoctorate or your doctorate at that point, followed by a 1-year residency. Okay. And actually, while we're on the subject, maybe you could just describe what a residency looks like before we completely wrap up here.
So, again, when I went to school, it was a little bit different. So I'm going to talk about what I know the residency to be now, because it was not my experience. I went through a different kind of program than people go through now. So the residency is going to be 1 year where you work in a practice with a proctor who's going to take you through the full gamut of all the different things an audiologist might be required to do, minus a couple very highly technical types of assessments. But you're going to be doing standard hearing aid or hearing testing battery, you're going to be fitting hearing aids, you're going to be doing vestibular assessments, you're going to be doing things that involve assessing brain waves as part of electrophysiology. You might be involved in oral rehabilitation, so training people how to use their hearing again. Okay. Those are the sorts of things that you'll experience during the residency.
Okay. All right. Very nice. And coming out of that school, you can expect to take a grueling exam. Lasting about the day, and then after that, you should be able to count on a pretty good abundance of jobs. Should have no problem finding work. As we said, this is probably a good long-term investment for somebody who's considering getting into the field. And as a general rule of thumb, in your experience, you found it to be a relatively low stress because, like you said, it's healthcare without. For one, of course, the shift work and the on-call work, that's very important for some people. I know myself, that was a huge factor in why I chose my field. But also the liability aspect of it. People who are, say, an MD or a DO, they have tremendous liability. I mean, they pay probably, from what I understand, 6 figures in liability insurance sometimes. So that's something to consider as well if you want to get into healthcare. But don't want to be constantly worried about if you're going to get sued.
Right.
This might be something. This might be something for you.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that wraps it up. Thank you everybody for watching, and stay tuned for the next one.